And now, today's featured speaker is Bentley University Associate Professor Marcus Stewart, class of 92, MBA 95. Marcus is a member of the Management Department, where his current research focuses on leadership, teams, cross-cultural skill development, diversity, and social justice. He is also a member of the Academy of Management Learning and Education Board, Human Resources Development Quarterly and Group, and Organization Management. Oh, there are three boards, excuse me. The editorial boards, Academy of Management Learning and Education, Human Resources Development Quarterly, and Group and Organization Management. He is co-author of an organizational behavior primer, currently in its 7th edition, and his research has been published in the Journal of Management, Journal of Applied Psychology and Personnel Psychology, among other journals, and in several edited volumes. His doctoral degree is in organizational behavior from the Keenan-Flagler Business School, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he is a double Falcon with an MBA and a Bachelor's of Science in Marketing, both earned at Bentley University. Without further ado, please join me in virtually welcoming Dr. Marcus Stewart. Thank you for coming to us today.
Thanks so much, Emily. Appreciate it. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm honored that I was invited by Emily in the office, the alumni office, to facilitate this session today on racial injustice in the United States. So excuse me if my eyes go down a little bit. I'm not used to kind of presenting and being able to reference my notes from the screen, but I'm not able to today. So I'll be up and down a little bit. I also kind of wanted to announce that this is, I'm viewing this a little bit as an opportunity to announce that we'll also support a 3-session kind of mini class. It's not a class. There's no credit and so forth for it, but the alumni office has been generous enough to support me in doing a series of 3 sessions, 3 one-hour sessions. I think it was starting July 22, 29, and August 5th, something like that, those Wednesday at noon. Where we can continue this conversation. I've kind of worked loosely from a book, from this book by Dr. Max Clow. And, but otherwise, the format will be fluid. I'll be happy to take questions and kind of build the sessions around things that you'd like to talk about or participants would like to talk about. And I'll also bring my own, kind of perspective from the social science area and via this book. So anyway, more to come on that, and you're welcome to be in touch anytime. So thanks to everyone for coming today. So I just want to, kind of setting the stage, note that I'll be speaking to you as I always am when I teach about diversity, whether in the classroom at Bentley or out in organizations, doing outside work. My philosophy is aligned with Dr. Blake Beers and kind of can be summarized in these statements, right? That we're here together to learn about very complex issues that have been challenging since we have history, right? Since we have recorded history. We all have some type of prejudice against something, some group, a class, or an individual. We all have, and we all have experienced some level of prejudice, right? So being discriminated against isn't kind of just a purview of one group or some subset of groups. We all individually and each of our groups have experienced prejudice. We're all guilty of some degree of cultural ignorance. None of us knows anything. I've been in school a long time, done a lot of reading, have published work and so forth, but I make mistakes all the time. I have many blind spots and things that just don't occur to me. My perspective is still limited by my experience of life, as it is for anyone else online. So let's have an open mind. Let's be supportive of one another and understanding when we make mistakes. We're not here to victimize each other. Let's try to have a kind of a climate of openness and trust and see how we can do. I know that I don't know how that all translates online so well, but just wanted to let you know where I'm coming from when I speak, when we go through our material today. Okay, so I'm gonna start, so speaking to the question of racial injustice and how we got here. How did we get to the situation that we face today, or that we're experiencing today? So I'm gonna describe just a couple of examples of classic studies that have been done in social science, social psychology, that help to kind of set the stage. So the first is a Robbers Cave experiment by the Sharifs and colleagues. The major publication for this is often cited as 1961, but the studies were run in 1954. So in this case, I'm going to go to my notes just to make sure I get some of the setting right for you. The study was the Sharifs were interested in conflict between groups, or group conflict. Realistic group conflict theory is the theory that came out of this work. It's very influential today. The study included 22 boys. 22 boys who were brought together for a 3-week summer camp. The setting is Robbers Canyon in Oklahoma. The group of boys, the 22 boys, was a very homogeneous group by design. So they were all white all Caucasian, all white individuals. They were all 12 years old, and they were chosen from a larger population of white 12-year-old boys who were all submitted to a battery of psychological tests. So they took several psychological tests to be sure that they were stable, that they were balanced, right? That these were healthy kids. None of the kids came from, all the kids came from stable backgrounds, stable families and stable homes. None of them were failing or struggling students, and none of them were social isolates. So these were, you know, middle class, you know, very mainstream, healthy young boys. Let's see. Okay, so they bring the boys together, and on day one at the start, they kind of form intervention one, or they conduct intervention one. In this case, they divide the boys into 2 teams, the Rattlers and the Eagles and the Rattlers, and they had the boys then engage in their groups in some team building exercises. So they, for example, came up with cheers for their team. They were encouraged to spend time talking about things that made being a member of their team so great. So they start to build that identity. Then they intervene again. In fact, they start to then have the boys, after doing the team building, start to engage in activities that created competition. So tug of war, Eagles versus Rattlers. Foot races and obstacle courses, Eagles versus Rattlers. They even encourage the teams to perform raids on the other group, like the other camp, get their Twinkies, get their chips and what have you, their Gatorade, whatever Gatorade was in 1954. So, sarsaparilla or something. So this created, within hours of having met each other, these boys who didn't know each other before, all 12 years old, all middle class, all from healthy, stable environments. Within hours, there were fistfights, right? Counselors had to step in, separate severe arguments, break up fistfights. So we see in terms of that human nature immediately. If I'm in a team and you help me, you allow me to build some, I'm in a group and I build some identity around that group membership, I can become very protective of that and very discriminatory or hostile toward non-group members. Now, shortly after, within hours after that activity, the counselors then start to introduce another set of interventions. So the boys are fighting, they're competing, the teams, the Eagles and Rattlers are going at it. Now the next intervention was to introduce what they called superordinate goals. Superordinate, meaning goals that the teams had to engage together in order to achieve. So for example, the boys were told that the truck that brings their supplies, their food and so forth, was broken down on the road a couple miles back before the camp. So in order to get that truck to camp so the boys could eat, they had to work together to push that truck, maneuver, and so forth to make it back. So they start to note the camaraderie and the cheering and the building of that larger inclusive identity, that superordinate identity around the achievement of those superordinate goals. So they note by the end of the session that there were still some boys did report some lingering kind of animosity toward the Eagles or the Rattlers, the other team, and affinity, maybe a longing for their initial team. But by and large, most of the hostilities and the in-group, out-group dynamics had faded after a series of superordinate goals and superordinate activities. So the Robbers Cave. Stanford Prison Experiment, many folks may be familiar with, took place in 1971 at Stanford University. In this case, they had 24 the number was 24 undergraduate students, again, who were selected from a larger pool based on their responses to a battery of psychological tests. Again, making sure you didn't have people who were susceptible to stress reactions and so forth, that everyone was stable, that everyone was comparable, healthy, and so forth. So, so this group of folks was randomly assigned to play. So, by the way, the study was designed to be a study of power, right? How do people deal with perceived power? So the participants were randomly assigned to be either prisoners or guards in the simulation. And the idea was that for 3 weeks, they would enact these roles in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford, which was crafted to be a prison, and no one who wasn't in the simulation was allowed in that basement during the time. So the prisoners were given jumpsuits, very simple jumpsuits with their ID number sewn in the back. The guards were given military style uniforms to wear, and the guards were instructed to make sure there was 24-hour surveillance over the prisoners. As many of you know, within 36 hours, so things start to go wrong immediately in terms of abusive behavior and based around the imbalance of power. And within 36 hours, one person assigned to a prisoner role had to be taken out of the experiment because of uncontrollable crying, irrational behavior, screaming, and so forth. That she, based on the experience she had in that. So in a day and a half, already a person is out. Within 6 days of this 3-week experiment, right, paying each participant $15 a day in 1971. After 6 days, they called it, right? And so it was so bad. The treatment, the conditions, they were really concerned about the trauma that the participants may be experiencing. So these studies kind of give us, some backdrop into the nature, some view into human nature, right? And that what we often consider in the idea of Black versus white, racism, or white racism toward Black and other racial minorities. We often think of it as a white versus other people thing, but it's a human thing. It's a human condition. In these cases, you have severe competition, efforts to undermine the other, and genuine hostility felt toward people of the same ethnicity, right? So we know that while race is a flashpoint for intergroup kind of hostility or competition, it's by no means the only. So many of our world conflicts and armed conflicts and wars are across religious lines, are across other lines of demarcation besides race. Within race competitions across socioeconomic status, disability status, gender, religion, you name it, right? So it's not specifically a race thing, but we know how human nature plays out when you have some competition over resources or disproportionate allocation of power. All right, so now those studies are from the 50s and the 70s, and they don't speak to racism specifically, but they speak to how people interact with each other when there is some competition or some in-group affinity and out-group hostility, how easily that can come about. What do we see today? Here are 2 examples that we won't delve into, but the first is a video. That link, I believe Bethany has put in the chat for you. It's a 28-minute video, I believe, that talks about World War II veterans coming back home from the war, and the Federal Housing Authority being created to help support people to getting housing. There was a shortage of housing, so there's a housing boom. Places are going up all over the country, new communities are going up around the country. The FHA was in place to provide mortgages so people could buy those homes. Black veterans were denied access to those loans. So you have this generation that comes back from war and buys these houses, and real estate, we know, is a major underpinning or foundation for building familial wealth. So Black veterans, Black people were excluded from those. So we have some huge, a major contributor. This is after slavery, of course, and all these other things, Jim Crow. But another step kind of in solidifying that divide between have and have-nots, white and Black. The The second link is for a recent piece. This was published last November 2019. And it was brought to my attention by one of our really sharp undergraduates, Fatoumata Keba. But she found this piece. It's a study done by Newsday over 3 years, I believe the period of time was. And they found that real estate agents were severely discriminating when it came to showing people of different ethnicities neighborhoods in which to buy a home. So they would tell, they talk about one neighborhood that's particularly difficult, Brentwood neighborhood or something, where there's lots of violence, housing values are depressed, and the agents would tell a Black or a Latino applicant, oh, this is a wonderful neighborhood, great people, heart and soul, blah, 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 salt of the earth. Whereas a white applicant would come in looking for an apartment or a home and mention that neighborhood, and we get a very different response. Like, I recommend you take a look at the, incidents of police calls or crime or what have you. Wait till this evening, wait till it gets dark, and just take a drive around that corner and see what's going on before you decide, right? So we see this pernicious race-based discrimination that continues. As a final piece, in terms of giving you a little bit of the research background, so we understand human nature can be very competitive and can be very status-based and seek advantage around resources. Oftentimes, though, you hear the idea that, well, now things are different, right? Generation Z, even millennials, and then Generation Z, each generation is the most diverse, more diverse than the prior generations, more accepting, more progressive in its thinking around race and gender and so forth. It's not necessarily the case. It's not holding up in terms of the work we do. This is a piece published in 2016. And some key things about this was a series of 3 studies. 2 of the studies done here, 2 of the experiments were done with undergraduates. So these are undergraduates in 2014, 2015, 2016. Right? This is clearly our most current college age generation, Generation Z. One of those samples of undergraduates was 75% women, 75% white women. Another one of those samples was entirely made of white men, white male undergraduates, a sample of 77 that you can see in the abstract there. So it's not an age-based thing, and it's also not necessarily a gender-based thing, right? We see this idea that, look, if when companies, this study finds that when companies just include any kind of pro-diversity message, they don't say racial diversity or gender diversity, they just say our company supports diversity and inclusion, blah, blah, to get the most from every employee, something like that. It doesn't specify a diversity group. And then the neutral companies don't say anything. They just say, we seek to get the maximum value or seek to support each unique individual, something like that. So the curious thing here is that, like, some of my research has found that there are individual differences, your attitude towards politics, your attitude toward racism and so forth, that your attitude towards affirmative action, that tend to moderate or change these results. Here you see in the last sentence of the last 2 sentences of the abstract, the effects they found, right? And this also tested heart, they did cardiovascular measures for anxiety, heart palpitate, faster heartbeat, like sweating, so forth, and found that white men performed more poorly and had, elevated cardiac activity when interviewing for a company when interviewing for a pro-diversity company. So very serious stuff. But they mentioned in the second last paragraph, these effects were not moderated by individual differences like racial identification, racial attitudes, fairness beliefs. That's pretty serious. That's not, I know other studies, including my own work, that has found those things matter. But this is compelling data kind of in the other direction, just to give you an idea of the severity of our current situation and how deep, how difficult some of these racial attitudes are to get at and to manage. All right. Okay, so where does that leave us, right? So we know, we just touched on just a little bit of what we know about human nature, a little bit of how things looked from a historical perspective around the 1930s to 2019. So just snippets of how things are playing out and informing us in terms of how we got to this place. How did we get here where we are? So what do we do moving forward? All right, well, we know We know that, like, for example, from the Roberts Cave research, that focus and effort towards superordinate goals can help to break down negative intergroup attitudes and behavior. When we are working collectively towards a common good, we can start the intergroup competitions and the intergroup identity, the meaningfulness can start to subside, can start to diminish, and we can become more, we can start to build that identity as a collective, right? And you'll see that, you know, I don't have a political agenda on this either way, but some of the criticism I saw of Donald Trump's most recent or his last kind of events were that they didn't see the message of the unification, like the team building, the nation building. Hey, we're in this together. We can get through this together. That would be building the superordinate goal and the superordinate identity, but rather kind of trying to create the us versus them, right? To catalyze the base was the analysis I read. This is Wall Street Journal over the last couple of days. But anyway, just to kind of demonstrate the idea of this notion of superordinate versus team separate goals is something that's very current and very relevant even today. It's playing out before us. Lead with our values. Okay, most of us, right? A lot of us have benefited from privilege, which makes it very difficult to understand how we are part of this racist system, right? The system that generates this racism, that generates these disparate outcomes for around education and healthcare and careers and generational wealth across groups. Why is it so different for white versus black and so forth? We recognize that, but we can do the work ourselves. And if I'm a white person, or even being me, a mixed person who identifies as African American, it's like, well, I didn't have anything to do with that, right? If I recognize that discrimination, and I also recognize it typically as inconsistent with my values, right? Something I'm not a part of or I don't want a part of. If I have a say in it, it won't be that way. However, the privilege is blinding, right? Privilege is blinding. When you've grown up with these advantages, right, that are just ubiquitous, they're just part of, it's like, you know, the analogy of asking a fish to describe water, right? What are you talking about? It's just how things are. It's just the world. So I'll use myself as an example, right? And we think about privilege, think about the typical white person in this country versus non-white, especially African American, who we know are disproportionately poor and lower socioeconomic classes. So I have a black parent and a white parent. My parents are alive, and my parents have been together my entire life. Major advantage accrues to that, right? That's privilege that I don't recognize for much of my life or in most of my daily activities, but I benefited majorly from that. Both my parents are college educated. And they cared about education. They made sure that my brothers and myself and my sister did our homework, went to school, that we valued learning and doing well in school. They set high standards, high expectations for us and held us accountable for those when it came to academics and our extracurricular activities. Those are huge, just that preparation, right? Solid, nutritious food, clean sheets, a clean place to live in. Major privilege that we don't consider. Now, it goes deeper, right? I mean, you can also talk about kind of winning the genetic lottery, right? So I happen to be healthy, right? Vision, I'm 6'3", I've never had health issues, so relatively athletic. That's privilege, right? A lot of people don't have that, haven't had that as their backdrop as they've gone through their life with, in my case, 2 parents, lots of education and positive messages around that for me, and so forth. So it can lead us to the question, like I went to college largely because of my parents' preparation and their expectations for me, right? And I know that holds true for a lot of people on this call, not everyone, but for a lot of us, probably the majority of us went to university, went to college because that was part of the plan. That was part of the plan when we were in vitro, part of the plan when we were 4 years old, 8 years old, 10. I don't remember any conversations between my parents and myself about college when I was 6, but they had those conversations. They got us to the best school they possibly could to be prepared. So those are major elements of privilege, right? So can I really take credit, right? One of the punchlines here is, am I justified in taking credit for being college educated? Or is that my parents' accomplishment? What role did I play in me getting a PhD versus the role my parents played? I was able to go to university for 10 years, 4 undergrad, 2 masters, 4 PhD, or 4 doctorate. What portion of people on the planet can afford 10 years of university without having to earn, without being responsible for family, et cetera, right? Privilege. That's privilege that accrued to me, big time. So what did I do, right? I had a basketball scholarship to go to Bentley. I didn't make myself 6'3". I didn't make it so I could jump out of the gym. I'm kidding. I was a good athlete, but I didn't create these genetics. I didn't even teach myself how to shoot, pass, dribble, defend, right? My father taught me that. My father made sure I went to camps. My father made sure I had the best coaching available. So what can I take credit for? Even my skill level, that was my father taking me and my brothers out and making us shoot daily, every other day, whatever it was, oftentimes against my will. I didn't want to do that practice. I didn't want to go through those workouts and so forth. I would have been watching TV, playing video games, etc. So what do I get to take credit for? That privilege, the kind of idea of being born on third base and thinking you hit a home run. So a lot of us have this need to cling to that privilege. We have to justify why we have this wealth and we achieved in school and all this. Typically, we like to believe that the world is just. We like to have faith in a just world. If the world is just, that means we deserve the things we have. We deserve these resources. We deserve this privilege. I deserve to have this 4,000 square feet, this 2,000 square feet, this 6,000 square feet to live in, with the boat on the water and so forth. I deserve these automobiles. I earned it. We might reconsider that, right? And it's not to say those things have to go away or that you're wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. We just followed the rules, right? But if as a white person, if as a male, if as a physically abled person, if as a Christian in this country, I follow the rules, I get things that typically I can expect in return. If I'm not those things, if I'm not a Christian, I'm not male, I'm not white, I'm not fully able and so forth, I can follow the rules and I may not necessarily get those same results. In fact, I should expect lesser results. So this is a pernicious nature of privilege, right? It's very difficult. And it's not the same thing to consider privilege as a white person or a white male versus some other groups. Like in our country, it's not the same thing. It's a really loaded process. It's difficult, it's trying. So, but if we address that, right, if we can get perspective on that and recognize that I'm not more deserving than anybody else. I'm not inherently more deserving. I'm not more entitled. I shouldn't necessarily have more than others just because I'm me. And I was born into this wonderful situation, right? There are others equally talented, more talented, and more ambitious and so forth with much less, who have received less in return for the same effort or for greater effort because of their various group memberships. The study that I put here, that I showed here, justify a lot of their explanation for why some white people are so resistant or experience threat in response to pro-diversity messages. It has to do with the idea that some white people, their quote here, perceive diversity as a zero-sum game. That zero-sum game is from that article. Whereas, so in other words, it's zero-sum in that if other people advance, if Black people advance, if they start getting more into college, if they take more jobs, if they get more jobs, if they make more money, then my group loses, then white people lose, or we lose. I can't have as much if they're gonna have more, right? This is, like, where that comes from, I don't know. Well, obviously if we perceive of resources as finite, then I suppose, there's some basis for that. But the way we've constructed our economies and so forth, we're not anywhere close to that in the moment, right? Our economies, our governments, our communities and so forth can look any way we want them, right? We can expand resources, generate resources in all kinds of creative, functional ways, so that no one has to lose. So a lot of this comes down to, if we're talking about this privilege deal, right? Again, it's hard work. This is not an hour thing. This is not 1 week. It's not a weekend retreat. This is weeks, months, probably years. It's probably an ongoing, right? For our lives, it's an ongoing task. It's an ongoing challenge to continue to check what are my values? How am I enacting those, right? How am I showing up in my community? What service am I providing in support of the world that I want to see in place? What do I teach? What do I teach my children? How do I teach them that? What do I consume in terms of media, movies, music, right? This comes up with our undergrads a lot in terms of all the music with the N-word, all the movies and media they consume that has the N-word just peppered through it, right? What do I consume? I maybe need to revisit that. And ultimately how I treat others. So this is a little primer in terms of a little bit of perspective that I see on it, and to maybe just get the conversation started. So we'll go to some Q&A, and again, I'll invite you all to join me for future sessions, and submit your questions, submit your issues. You can be in touch with me personally, with Emily, the alumni office, and let's get it together.
All right,
So,
thank you
Emily?
so much. Yeah, let's get started with some questions. This is an awesome way to ground the conversation. Thank you again for your lecture. This is extremely relevant. So the first question we'll start with that was pre-submitted was, how do we speak up for students or coworkers? We could expand that, but we'll start with students and coworkers without causing embarrassment to the offender. Perhaps they don't see their actions or their words as being racist.
All right, so thanks for the question. It's a challenging situation, an issue that you raised. So I think that my first answer is it depends, right? It depends on who you are, right? Each of us individually will have a different comfort level and a different way that we communicate, a different way that we deal with confrontation, if that's what you want to call it, or a different way we deal with difficult situations. We'll all have different ways of dealing with injustice in the moment. So for some of us, we would be very comfortable calling out, hey, wait a minute, I don't think that's appropriate. What do you mean by that? Well, excuse me, I think that may have been mistaken, right? That may have been misunderstood. Excuse me, am I hearing you right? I couldn't help but notice, right, that you said, or I couldn't help but notice that Emily kind of looked a little bit disappointed or upset after your interaction. So I think the main thing is here, doing the self-work. What am I comfortable doing in the moment? This also is going to change based on, was that the CEO? Was that your boss that you saw make the inappropriate comment, or was it an intern that's doing 6 hours a week? So there are so many variables that come to play in this. The key things will be, who am I and what am I about? Again, lead with our values. So if it's important to me to get this communicated, then I'll find a way. I can do that offline afterward. I can listen. I'm not going to say anything in the moment because others are around. I don't want to embarrass anyone. Can we catch up for lunch? Can I stop by your office at 1 or after lunch? Are you going to be around? How about morning? I know we can get coffee and blah, blah, and we can have that conversation offline with either or both parties. So we're only limited, that question is a great one. It's a challenging one. We're only limited by our motivation, our resolve to get it done, to find a way, and our creativity, right? Those are the only limitations when it comes to that area. Next, I suppose.
The next question is related because it's about talking about racism and the systemic issues that we're dealing with. But this question comes from someone who's a parent wanting to know how they can engage their family in how they speak, act, and think, and what changes should they speak to their family about?
Mm-hmm. Another great question. Challenging and timely. So I have a 9-year-old and a 10-year-old. So that's going into 4th and 5th grade. And so I'm living that very thing. In fact, both of my kids at their last modules in school this year, which I became intimately familiar with because of the homeschooling situation. So they were talking about, the revolution, Revolutionary War, the Native, treatment of Native Americans. Also slavery was a big part of that. So I heard that, for the first time, kind of going on with my kids in conversation formally through school and what they're reading and their activities. For me and for my wife, I feel like we've we try to take the route of encouraging our kids to be open-minded, to ask questions, to not shush them. You know, like you see someone with the crutches or in the wheelchair, or someone who looks different, their hair, what they're wearing, to not shush them and don't ask, but to try to encourage them to be polite when they ask, to be respectful, right? Look the person in the eye, say, excuse me, make sure they're paying attention to you, make sure they're okay with the conversation. So that's one route I know we try to take, you know, kind of overtly or explicitly take that approach. I think also when we hear things or see in their television programs, in their video games, how they interact with others, like Minecraft or the villagers and all these, but you know, they have opportunities to make choices about how they treat others, even in their video games. So just having a conversation about that. Like, I'm not saying don't put all the villagers in the building and blow it up. Like, okay, you're 9, you're gonna do whatever the game allows you to do, but let's talk about, you know, why is that so fun? Like, how would you think the villagers would feel? You know, so just some of those conversations from time to time. We don't browbeat them with that, but I don't know, I think conversation that asks questions, that doesn't blame and say, don't you ever do that, but let's think about that. Let's give it some consideration. How would the others feel? How would you feel? You know, working on some empathy. And then specific choices around entertainment for us, around movies that we watch, and talking about those movies. Who are the heroes? Why were the bad guys bad? And what made the good guys good? Or what made the heroes heroes and the villains villains? To take gender out of that. So that's a very short and brief something, but at least to start maybe.
No, that's helpful for me. I was thinking about your Minecraft example on my own son, so thank you.
There you go.
We have a question that's sort of along those same lines about, you know, heroes versus villains, and talking about language being important. And this question comes from someone who runs an IT organization, and now they're looking at some of the terminology that's particularly loaded, like white or blacklisting. Is there a good place that catalogs these loaded terms? How might somebody go about finding how to make changes in their organization?
Okay, so I'm not exactly sure I got the question. So there was something about terminology, white, black, but then there was something.
Yeah, for example, in our advancement operations, we've changed the term blacklisted to do not contact in perpetuity or something like that, because that could be viewed as a loaded term.
Okay,
so good resources to go to kind of reframe our language?
You know, probably. I don't know. I can't name a resource for you. I do know, and some of it's been controversial. I think it was UMass. I don't remember if it was UMass Amherst, UMass Boston. One of the UMass affiliate schools. Or no, maybe it wasn't UMass. It was just Amherst. I think it was Amherst College. Their Office of Diversity and Inclusion, or the Multicultural Center, had come up with kind of a pamphlet, a booklet or something that outlined different terms, what they meant, their usage and all that stuff. But I think that was fairly controversial and a little heavy-handed. I don't know, honestly. And I think oftentimes just critical thinking, common sense, and being willing to change, right? If you're willing to say, like for my opening slide, like we don't know everything, we make mistakes, okay, we have blinders, and things change. Like there might have been a period of time where, you know, colored or Negro or whatever was fine, that was the term of the day, but then suddenly it's enough, like things change. So I wouldn't beat ourselves up over, you know, nomenclature too much. I think the intent is more important, and the willingness and ability to say, made a mistake, totally blinded, like, I'm working on it, we're working on it, and go from there. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have maybe a better answer.
Yeah, look, some people are putting resources in the chat, so we'll try to make sure we share those as well too.
I'm not seeing any of that. I see it popping up, but I can't start reading else.
That's okay. All right. Next question is, what book or resources provided the most formative insight, in your opinion, on racial injustice, other than the book you'll be using for our future sessions, the one you mentioned earlier?
So I do want to take us back to that, because that is definitely my first. This is what I'm using currently in my undergrad classes and my grad classes. this is, just for full disclosure, Max Cloud is a white gentleman, a white man. And I think there's some potency around that because of his experience of dealing with privilege. He's also, a middle class, upper middle class, from Connecticut. So, he really does a great job talking about those experiences over time. Like, when I was a teenager in high school, when I was in university, when I was on this service trip, when I was whatever, like over and over again, having those breakthroughs and the awakening, like, oh, this is what privilege looks like. Oh, this is what racism feels like for another, for a Black person or an Asian person or something. But it's over and over. You don't have an inoculation or one breakthrough and you're done, you're good. It's constant work, and those blinders, it's like peeling back the layers of the onion. Like, it's an ongoing process. So I think it does a great job there. Also, I think it helps to really give some perspective in the idea that, look, white men are vilified and white men are kind of cast as, the problem so often in our discussions now. But, Max does a great job here pointing out for us that this is really a historical circumstance. And if we think about none of the white people that we know, white men, women, children, were alive when these systems were created. All right. So yes, we did have racist slave-owning presidents, George Washington, governors, Supreme Court justices, and all the rest, speakers of the House, and you name it. And they put in place systems, policies, and so forth to help keep their groups, their families, and their particular interests in power, with maintaining resources, and to keep others from getting that. That's not a surprise. Robbers Cave, Stanford Prison, we can go on and on. So no surprise there. But now you have these white men and white people walking around that didn't ask for it, in fact, resent the idea that they're privileged, right? So they're in pain. Like, wait a minute, I don't deserve this. I didn't earn this. This was given to me. I benefited from an unfair system. That's pain. And here we are on the other side, people of color experiencing the pain of, I'm trying twice as hard and I get half as much back because of these. I'm paying more for my mortgage, more for my used car, more for getting less in healthcare in return for the same dollar. So, so we share that pain, right? It's coming from different places, and there are different ways that we have to go about working through it, but we share it. So this is the book I'm going to point out right now. Others for me, another great one. Our Separate Ways, or Our Separate Voices. It's a book by Stella Nkomo, Nkomo, and Ella Bell, Bell, Nkomo and Bell, or Bell and Nkomo. And that really focuses on race and gender. So it tracks Black women and white women. I'm forgetting, like 15, 20 Black women, 15, 20 white women, tracks them through. And in fact, there's a series of studies in their book, that is really, so enlightening about, at least if you want to talk career and organizational issues, race and gender. There's so many others, but I'll leave with those for right now.
I should mention that we hope to have a discussion board feature to your upcoming seminar series. So we'll be able to share more resources as we go, and we'll keep sharing them in the chat here with our remaining time. So thank you. The next question is, does talking about race make it exist more? If so, what's the solution? Targeting a racial group for a collective structural crime seems to many people the very definition of racism.
Okay, so the first part of that was, does talking about race make it worse?
Yeah, and I'm wondering.
The second part was something else, I think.
Essentially, I think what this person's trying to say is, does talking about perhaps a specific crime or collective structural crime as it regards to racism make racism more prevalent, or the concept of racism, continue?
Yeah. I guess I'll have to defer. I'm not totally sure about the second half of that question. Really the types of crime that we talk about can come into play. If we think about kind of stereotypes and groups, I think we may think of Black men or Black youth as robbing, the 7-Eleven or, street crime type stuff. And there's a different idea of that and a different experience of that as opposed to white collar crime, the multi-million and, multi-million dollar crimes done by, that are typically perpetrated by white men. Not exclusively, but in our country, that's what we see quite often. So I think, the type of the crime, the nature of the crime maybe comes into play. And I would say I don't think it's racist to talk about it. And I don't think it's racist to talk about a correlation between some group demographic in the crime. If it's a fact, it's a fact. If a disproportionate number of Black people commit those crimes, 7-Eleven robberies, fine. Let's also acknowledge that a disproportionate amount of other crime is perpetrated by other demographics. And I think you really move past the racism element if we talk about, well, what are the implications of these types of crime? What's the resource exchange? What's the cost? Where does that money go? Who does it benefit? And so forth. What happens to the perpetrators of those crimes? Are they treated equitably based on the nature of the crime and so forth? So I think if you want to carry the conversation through and be willing to challenge, be willing to ask critical questions, be willing to gather the data, I don't think there's any conversation that should be out of bounds. And so, following on that, I don't think talking about race makes it worse. I think it can make it much, much better. Ignoring race, while it is a problem, I think would be the issue, right? So if we ignore it, then how do we deal with this privilege? If we ignore it, right, if Colin Kaepernick never took the knee, would we be experiencing the upheaval, the momentum we have now in 2020 if he didn't do what he did in 2016, which was kept throwing race in our face, right? Wouldn't let it die. Like, what's his problem? Let it go. And here we are.
Another question about systemic racism. With the whole school to prison pipeline, perhaps you can talk a little bit about, is it possible to dismantle racism, in your opinion, without reforming the role of our school systems as sort of gatekeepers to the judicial and penal systems?
Yeah, okay, so is it possible for us to alter or intervene on that pipeline without altering, structurally in some fundamental way our education system, for example? I think it is possible, but then you have to allocate the resources elsewhere, all right? So then people have to be supported, people have to be educated and get perspective through another means other than school. People have to get kind of career, life and career direction and so forth, have to become aware of social dynamics in places other than just school, if you're going to really intervene on that pipeline. I think schools are a likely candidate because everyone has to go there. Our tax dollars support that. So there are resources specifically in place and laws that compel us to send our children to these places to be informed about our lives and how we live and about our world. So to me, that's the place that makes sense for intervention. That's the place that makes sense for restructuring and for creating something more progressive. But can it happen outside that? Yes. I mean, we know the stories of that principal, that teacher, that parent who runs the after-school program or has kids there at 5 a.m. doing math and spelling bees and you can operate outside the formal school day and formal school system and be successful. You just are now taking it on yourself to do it. You have to find other means. And for the masses, that's probably less likely or a much longer process. Could we do this in 10 years, 20 years with major restructuring of our education? Yes. The way it is now, okay, maybe 100 years, but it's still coming.
The next question is, what is your opinion on the separation of African Americans from people of color during this time where African Americans are asking for equity based on their history in this country? So often, people of color is used to satisfy hiring requirements and quotas, and that leaves African Americans further subjugated in America.
Yes. Let's do some easy ones.
I know.
So thanks for the question. It's really insightful. So I can go multiple directions on this. I have heard it's common for me to hear from my elders My mentors, a lot of my mentors, professors I had when I was at Bentley, and folks that I really admire and respect that are African American, I've heard them specifically tell me that, advise me that we should keep the issues and the movement for African Americans separate from gender, right? From feminism, separate from disability inclusion, separate from LGBT, right? Because of some of the reasons that I think came through in the question, the idea of African American interests then being subordinated to others, while we have this unique history, this unique role, we've made this unique contribution to the founding of the country and the building of this industrial empire, right? That just altered the economy, the world's economy, and made the United States the epicenter. So I get that our history is totally different. Our contributions are very different. Others also contributed. Now, Latin American labor, Chinese labor, Japanese building the railroads. I mean, hey, a lot of people contributed. So there you start to get the people of color. Like, wait, we were slaves. Other people were slaves, not in the same numbers. But we built railroads. Other people built railroads. We fought the Indians. Other people fought Indians. Indians fought Indians. So to me, it gets tricky. I understand the perspective. If you mix this women's movement with the black movement's going to get put aside. This is what we saw with affirmative action, right? Affirmative action is always talked about as this race thing, race. White women are the major beneficiaries of that, according to the data, in terms of career advances, educational advances. The spike after the introduction of affirmative action, the spike is for white women. It's not for people of color. So in terms of improving their overall situation. So I get it. So that would be rationale to say, look, we can't, if we start teaming up with other groups, it's not going to happen for us, it's going to happen for others. I hear that and I get it. Personally, I tend to think that as long as we allow some group to be exploited, we're not going to break through. Black people will, so as Black people, we would rather be the new white people and have disabled people, or have LGBT, or have women, like have another group be the out group or be the dominated group. I think we have to rise together, but I'm conflicted in saying that because I totally get the idea that, history tells us that it happens, it's likely, I don't know, that if we roll these movements into one, or we combine the African American or Black movement with others, that yes, resources are siphoned off. Attention is taken away from that specific issue instead of issues. So I don't have a straightforward response, but I can see the merit in the argument both ways. I think we all have to rise.
Yeah, it's a challenging time, that's for certain. And we did have a great workshop from the Center for Women in Business on intersectionality. So that would be another place for those who are seeking additional resources on sort of where some of these identities cross paths to look into.
And they're tremendous in the Center for Women in Business. Jado, Farhan Abbas, and Trish Foster. I mean, just a great group,
We'll always plug our colleagues who are doing good work. All right, so we have time for a couple more questions.
Sure.
One question is, we primarily, at least right now, have a two-party political system in our country, which often leads to serious divisiveness from the top. How much of our social issues do you think are attributed to this situation? Would a more diverse political system help or hurt in resolving some of these social, societal issues?
These are great questions. So I do think, part of the challenge for the United States is the two-party system as it is now, where, it's become a big business establishment, big money deal. So if you're a third-party candidate, you can't participate in debates on TV. So you can't, you're out. You're not going to win. You're not going to get visibility. You must, no matter what your take is or your platform is, you must be able to shoehorn it either into the Democratic platform or the Republican platform, or you're out of it, generally speaking, at the national level, right? Generally speaking, at the national level. So meanwhile, our issues and the challenges we face, and think about our population, the electorate, is super diverse. So to think that two parties are somewhat representative of that diverse group of people in this country, I think is crazy. They're not representative. So I think that's an issue that we face. I don't think it helps, but I also, it is also entirely possible that a system with many parties can be dysfunctional. If I think of, I don't know, I don't want to go to specific examples, but in such a short time, and this being recorded, who knows what might happen. But I don't think it's the system specifically or only the system. I think a more legitimate multi-party system would help us if we had viable third, fourth, fifth parties. That would really help. But if we do politics the same way, then I don't think it matters. Like, if it's a resource grab, and if it's a thing where, like with our two parties now, if we have five parties who say, well, I won, so you're gonna lose. I'm gonna try to step on, I'm gonna try to get all the resources, make all the policies my way, point all the court justices my way, blah, 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 screw you. Then we're still in the same situation, even if you have 10 or 20 parties. I don't think that's the thing. So the idea that when the Democrats win, they say, hey, screw you, Republicans, grow up, get a life, realize the world's changed, blah, blah, blah. And then the Republicans win and say the same thing to the Democrats. Like, yeah, if that was two other parties or five different parties, I don't think that matters. It's a mindset and being in this together. One of my best friends has been in New Zealand the last 3-4 years. And the way he talks about politics and going through change and leadership, it can be done well. It can be done without the hostility. It can be done without the animosity. It can be done without trying to undermine the other side. So that's what it's not the number of parties, but I do think that is an issue for us.
Thank you. And then thinking about the academic realm where you see yourself, is there an academic discipline that has the furthest to go as far as anti-racism?
I have no idea. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you're talking about like the field, the study itself, is there something inherently racist about geology or actuary? I don't know. Or is it about diversifying those areas? Like, so how do we get more African-American geologists or more African-American actuaries or something like that? Maybe that's, so I'm not exactly sure where the question is coming from, but I don't think maybe there is in reality some hierarchy where some professions are more open, more supportive. Certainly we know that education has been a place where historically or traditionally women and African-Americans have found safer haven, as opposed to, say, accounting or some of the other professions. Medicine has also been that to a certain extent for different groups. So, but yeah, I don't know of a hierarchy specifically.
All right, well, we're at the top of the hour. I apologize if we didn't get to any of your questions. Again, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Dr. Stewart if you have questions. We're always happy to respond. We'll try to respond by email to those of you who ask specific questions. Again, this is also not the end of our work with Professor Stewart. He will be back. We will be doing a 3-part series on this very prevalent topic and trying to make some change ourselves. So please feel free to reach out to us, and thank you again for sharing your time with us. Do you have any last thoughts you'd like to share?
I do. Thank you, Emily. So again, I want to express my appreciation to everyone for coming to the session, for those incredible questions and all the questions we haven't gotten to. I did prepare responses for other questions we received yesterday or up until yesterday. And we're, as Emily mentioned, we'll try to work on getting a discussion board up. So we're working on ways or means to kind of continue to process your questions in the meantime. And also I'll make sure that, I have what you submitted so far today and can build that into and kind of build those future sessions around those questions. So we're getting at what we want to talk about.
Great. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great afternoon or wherever time it is where you are.